Some men build empires the way storms build themselves, not by asking permission, but by swallowing everything slower than they are. Caedric Valebrant was that kind of man. Duke of Blackmere, commander of iron fleets, heir to the oldest war bloodline in the kingdom of Verelis. And on the morning he threw away his wife like a receipt he no longer needed. He believed he was making the smartest move of his life. He was wrong, but the kind of wrong that takes everything from you before you understand the cost. Stay until the end of this one, because the moment a man discovers he has handed his entire kingdom to the woman he just humiliated, that is the moment the real story begins. The rain began before the bells. It came sideways off the northern sea, lashing across the black granite walls of Blackmere Fortress with the kind of violence that made servants close shutters and soldiers pull their cloaks tighter against the watchtowers. The sky was bruised, not dawn gray, not storm purple, something uglier, the color of an old wound that never healed right. Caedric Valebrant stood at the tall arched window of the ducal chambers and watched the water crawl down the glass like the fortress itself was weeping. He did not care about the weather. He had not cared about weather since the winter campaign of his 23rd year, when he marched 6,000 men through a mountain blizzard to take Fort Kessler and came back with 4,000 and a reputation that made grown commanders lose their appetite at the sound of his name. He was already dressed. Black military coat, silver buttons stamped with the Valebrant wolf crest, boots polished to a mirror finish that reflected candlelight like a blade. His dark hair was pulled back from a face that had been called many things, striking, severe, merciless, but never kind. There was a scar running along his left jawline from a duel he won at 19. He wore it the way other men wore medals. Behind him, the chamber was spotless, every surface gleaming, every book aligned on the shelves as though they feared being out of order. This was not a room that tolerated imperfection. It was not a home. It was a statement. "Your Grace." Aldrich Marsh stood in the doorway, chief solicitor. 40 years of legal silence compressed into a man who looked like he had been carved from parchment and anxiety. He held a leather folder against his chest the way a soldier holds a shield. "Is it done?" Caedric asked without turning from the window. "The documents are prepared. The court has been notified. The Chancellor's representative arrived an hour ago to witness." "And Evelyn?" Marsh hesitated. It was barely a flicker. A man less observant would have missed it entirely. Caedric caught it the way a hawk catches a flinch in the grass below. "Lady Evelyn has been informed," Marsh said carefully. "She is dressing." "Good." One word. No inflection. No cruelty in the delivery, which somehow made it worse. Cruelty at least acknowledges the existence of another person's pain. Caedric's tone was administrative, a man closing an account. He turned from the window. His eyes, slate gray, cold enough to make the temperature in a room feel like it dropped, swept across Marsh without landing. The Arden delegation? Assembled in the East Gallery. Lady Celestine arrived last evening with a full retinue. 12 attendants. Her father, the Chancellor, sends his formal regards and a case of Valian brandy. Brandy. Caedric almost smiled. Almost. The muscles near his mouth shifted, but the expression died before it reached his eyes. "The man sells me his daughter and sends spirits to celebrate. At least he is honest about what this is." Marsh said nothing. He had survived 21 years in service to House Valebrant by knowing exactly when to be furniture. Caedric pulled on his gloves, black leather, lined with something soft that no one would ever see. He straightened his cuffs with the precision of a man who understood that details were not vanity. They were armor. "Bring the court to order," he said. "We begin in 30 minutes." The Great Hall of Blackmere Fortress was designed to make human beings feel temporary. Stone columns rose 40 feet toward vaulted ceilings painted with war scenes so old the blood had faded to rust. Iron chandeliers hung from chains thick enough to moor warships. The floor was polished obsidian, black as frozen water, reflecting every figure that crossed it like a dark mirror, showing you your own smallness. 200 members of the Verelis court filled the gallery seats in silks and furs and the particular brand of elegant discomfort that comes from watching someone else's life get dismantled as public entertainment. They whispered behind gloved hands, They adjusted their jewels. They pretended not to be thrilled. Caedric entered from the eastern corridor, and the whispers stopped as if someone had cut the air supply. He walked the center aisle alone. No attendants flanking him, no advisors trailing behind. Just one man crossing obsidian stone with the kind of stride that made generals step aside and courtiers rearrange their faces into something respectful. He reached the raised platform beneath the ducal seal, a wolf with iron teeth gripping a crown, and turned to face the court. "This proceeding is administrative," he announced. His voice carried without effort. Not loud, certain. The kind of voice that understood volume was for men who were not sure people would listen. "The marriage between House Valebrant and the Marrow line is dissolved by sovereign clause. Property compensation has been rendered. Terms are final." He paused. "Lady Celestine Arden will be formally introduced as the next Duchess of Blackmere at the Chancellor's Summit in 14 days. The court exhaled, some in admiration, some in calculated assessment, a few in something closer to horror that they quickly converted into neutral expressions. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened. Evelyn Marrow walked in alone. She wore pale silver silk that caught the gray light from the clerestory windows and turned it into something almost luminous. Her dark hair was unadorned. No jewels, no crest, no family emblem pinned to her collar because the servants had already removed it from her wardrobe that morning while she dressed in silence. She was 31 years old, not beautiful the way Celestine was beautiful, all sharp strategy and calculated glamour. Evelyn's face carried the kind of stillness that made you look twice. High cheekbones, dark eyes that held their ground the way old trees hold soil. There was something in the way she moved through that hall, unhurried, shoulders level, chin neither raised in defiance nor dropped in defeat, that made certain members of the court look away. Not from pity, from recognition. They had seen that walk before. On soldiers coming back from campaigns they survived but could not explain. She stopped 12 feet from the platform, the exact distance protocol required for a dissolved party to stand during annulment proceedings. Caedric looked at her, for exactly 2 seconds. Something crossed behind his eyes, fast, buried, killed before it reached the surface, and then it was gone. He looked through her the way windows look through rain. She was already a thing behind glass. "The terms of dissolution are recorded," he said. His voice did not change. "Compensation has been deposited into the Marrow Family Trust. You are released from all obligations to House Valebrant effective immediately." Evelyn said nothing. The court waited for tears, for a scene, for the kind of emotional collapse that would give them something to discuss over wine for the next 6 months. They got silence. Caedric's jaw tightened, an almost invisible shift. A man who had expected resistance finding something worse, absence. She was standing right there, and she had already left. "You were compensated generously," he said, and this time there was an edge to it. Not kindness, irritation, the particular frustration of a man who has rehearsed his dominance and the audience is not performing its role. "Take whatever dignity remains and leave Blackmere before nightfall." Evelyn looked at him, not with anger, not with sorrow, with the steady, terrible patience of someone who has already done the math on what this moment costs and decided she can afford it. "I wish you clarity, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was quiet, clear, the kind of calm that has a basement full of locked rooms, the kind that comes after you have run out of people willing to tell you the truth. She turned. She walked back down the center aisle through 200 staring faces without changing her pace by a single step. The doors closed behind her, and Caedric Valebrant stood on his platform in his fortress, in his kingdom, and told himself he felt nothing. The lie tasted like iron. Outside, the rain had become merciless. Evelyn's carriage waited in the lower courtyard where the service carts loaded supplies. Not the main entrance. Not the grand staircase where Valebrant carriages departed beneath carved wolf archways. The back, where deliveries were made and refuse was removed. She noticed. She catalogued it. She filed it in the expanding archive of small humiliations that she would either burn through or burn down. Her lady's maid, Petra, waited by the carriage with a single trunk and the expression of a woman trying very hard to turn fury into professionalism. "They would only allow one trunk, my lady." "I know." "Your correspondence, your mother's jewelry, The library of personal volumes you collected over 5 years. All of it has been. They said it would be held pending. I know, Petra. The maid's composure cracked like thin ice. This is not how a duchess is treated. I am not a duchess anymore. You are more than. Get in the carriage! Eveline's voice was not unkind, but it was final. The voice of a woman who understood that if she stopped moving long enough to feel what was happening, she would not start again. Petra climbed in. Eveline stood for a moment in the rain, her silver silk turning dark with water, and looked back at the fortress. Blackmere rose above her like a mountain with windows, thousands of lights burning against the storm, towers that had watched empires rise and rot for 300 years. She had spent 5 years inside those walls, 5 years learning how to breathe in a house that considered affection a tactical error, 5 years sitting across dinner tables from a man who could command 10,000 soldiers and could not say one honest sentence to the woman sleeping next to him. 5 years watching Caedric Valebrant build an empire while systematically demolishing every human instinct that might have made him worth the kingdom he was assembling. She had loved him once. That was the part she did not discuss, not because it was too painful, but because it was too stupid. Loving Caedric was like loving winter. You could admire it, you could even find beauty in it, but it would freeze you to death without noticing. She climbed into the carriage. The driver did not speak. The wheels began to turn. The fortress grew smaller behind them, swallowed slowly by rain and northern fog until it disappeared entirely. Eveline reached beneath her left glove and touched the edge of a folded document she had carried against her wrist since 4 o'clock that morning. The paper was old, heavy cotton bond with the Valebrant seal pressed into the margins. 3 signatures at the bottom, a royal notary, a sovereign witness, and the trembling hand of Lord Caedric Valebrant, Caedric's father, who had signed it 11 months before his death. She did not unfold it. She did not need to. She had memorized every clause, every subclause, every legal footnote that the dying lord had insisted she understand before the ink was dry. Caedric Valebrant had been many things: a complicated patriarch, a ruthless strategist in his own right, a man who had watched his son become something efficient and empty and terrifying. But he had not been a fool. You must understand something about my son, Caedric had told her during their last private meeting. He was already disappearing then, lungs filling with what the physicians called a progressive condition and what Caedric called the one enemy he could not outflank. Caedric does not collect power because he wants it. He collects it because he cannot feel anything else. And a man who feels nothing will eventually throw away every person standing between him and the throne, including you. Then why did you allow the marriage? Because I hoped I was wrong. The old duke had looked at her with eyes that still cut like his son's, but carried something Caedric's never did: regret. I was not wrong, so now we prepare for what comes after. What came after was this: every mine in the northern range, every harbor from Blackmere to the Kessler coast, every fortress, estate, military contract, an acre of sovereign land belonging to House Valebrant, all of it transferred under an emergency succession clause into the legal authority of Lady Eveline Marrow, with a provision that no reversal could occur without her direct, witnessed, voluntary consent. Caedric had buried the transfer inside a routine estate amendment that Caedric's lawyers processed alongside 200 other documents during the inheritance transition. Nobody read it carefully. Nobody questioned it. The old lord had counted on his son's arrogance, the assumption that nothing in the family archive could possibly threaten him. And he had been right. Eveline pressed her gloved fingers against the document and felt the weight of a kingdom resting against her pulse. She did not smile. Smiling was for people who had not yet learned what it cost to hold this kind of weapon. The carriage rocked through the mountain pass. Rain hammered the roof. Somewhere behind her, Blackmere was already becoming a memory. Ahead of her, south and east, past the frozen river valleys and the scorched farmland of the border provinces, Grafin waited, a broken territory, an abandoned coast, the kind of place powerful men forgot about because it offered nothing worth taking, which made it perfect. Because Eveline Marrow had just lost everything visible, her title, her home, her name inside the most powerful house in Varelis. And in exchange, she had gained the one thing that terrified men like Caedric more than war. Leverage they did not know existed. Back inside the fortress, the celebration had already begun. Celestine Arden arrived in the great hall like a weapon dressed in emerald. She was 26, golden-haired, sharp-featured, with the kind of smile that calculated its effect before it reached her lips. Every movement calibrated, every word weighed against its strategic value before it left her mouth. The Chancellor's daughter had been raised in the political furnace of the Varellus court, the way blades were raised in the forge, hammered, folded, hammered again until what remained was harder than the original metal. She crossed the obsidian floor toward Caedric, and the court watched the way audiences watch the opening act of something they know will eventually draw blood. "Your Grace," she curtsied with geometric precision, "I am honored by the trust you place in this alliance." "Sit down, Celestine." Caedric gestured to the chair beside his on the platform. "We can skip the theater. Everyone in this room already knows the terms." Something flickered behind her composure. Not offense. Assessment. She was measuring the man she had agreed to marry the way an engineer measures a bridge, checking for stress points. "As you prefer," she said smoothly. She took the seat, arranged her skirts, made eye contact with 3 different noble factions across the gallery in the time it took most women to adjust a glove. General Harlan Corwick, Caedric's military commander, approached the platform with the heavy tread of a man who had spent 30 years breaking things for a living and had developed opinions about it. "A word, Your Grace. In private." "Speak." Corwick glanced at Celestine, then at the court, then back at Caedric with an expression that said what words would cost him his position to deliver. "In private." Caedric studied his general the way predators study movement. 3 seconds. Then he rose and walked Corwick to the antechamber behind the great hall, where maps covered the walls and the air smelled like cold stone and candle wax. Corwick closed the door and dropped every pretense. "You just made a mistake. Careful, Harlan." "I am being careful. That is why I am telling you behind a closed door instead of in front of 200 people who already think you have lost your mind." Corwick ran a thick hand across his jaw. Evelyn Marrow held this household together for 5 years. She managed the accounts, she handled the northern trade disputes, she kept your ministers from cutting each other's throats when you were away on campaign. You think that was decoration? She was a competent administrator. I compensated her accordingly. You compensated her the way you compensate a horse you are selling. You stripped her crest in public. You had her carriage moved to the service yard. Half the court thinks you did it to humiliate her deliberately, and the other half thinks you did it without thinking, which is worse. The marriage served its purpose. The Arden alliance serves the future. The Arden alliance serves the Chancellor. Corwick stepped closer, close enough that in any other context it would have constituted a physical challenge. Celestine is her father's instrument. You understand that. You have always understood that. So what I cannot figure out is why a man who trusts no one has just invited the Chancellor's daughter into the center of his operations. Caedric's face did not move. That was the most dangerous sign Corwick knew. When the Duke's expression went still, it meant the machinery behind his eyes was operating at a speed that did not require external display. "The Chancellor controls the Crown Council votes," Caedric said quietly. "Without those votes, the Supreme Regency goes to House Davonmore, and Davonmore will dismantle every military contract we hold within 6 months. So this is defense." "Everything is defense, Harlan. The men who think they are playing offense are the ones who have not noticed the blade already at their throat." Corwick held his gaze, then shook his head slowly. "You are the most intelligent man I have ever served, and the most determined to ruin yourself." He turned toward the door. Stopped. "Evelyn knew things about this estate that you never bothered to learn. Operational details, ledger structures, contract hierarchies your father built before you took the seat. If there is anything buried in those records that could, there is nothing buried in those records. You are sure?" "I am sure." He was not sure. He had never once reviewed the full estate archive his father left behind. He had assumed, with the particular confidence of a man who has never been fundamentally wrong, that an inheritance was simply a transfer, that what belonged to his father now belonged to him, that the dead did not get final moves. Corwick left. Caedric stood alone in the map room and listened to the muffled applause from the great hall as Celestine charmed the court with the effortless precision of a woman who had rehearsed spontaneity her entire life. The rain hammered the windows. Something in his chest, something he did not have vocabulary for because he had systematically eliminated the emotional language required to identify it, tightened when he thought of Evelyn walking down that aisle in wet silver silk. He killed the thought, the way he always killed the thoughts, efficiently, without ceremony, the way you snuff a candle that has no business still burning. 3 weeks later, Aldrich Marsh knocked on the door of the ducal study at 11 o'clock at night with a face the color of old ash. "Your Grace, we have a problem." Caedric looked up from the military dispatches spread across his desk. "Define problem." Marsh entered and closed the door behind him with the exaggerated care of a man delivering explosive material. He placed the leather folder on the desk. His hands trembled. "The Royal Treasury has frozen all Valebrant accounts pending a verification audit." "On what grounds?" "Contested ownership." The words landed in the room like a dropped blade. Caedric's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still, the kind of still that preceded the worst decisions of his career. "Contested," he repeated. "By whom?" Marsh opened the folder. Inside were copies of legal filings, royal seal verifications, and a succession amendment bearing the unmistakable signature of Lord Caedric Valebrant. "By your father, your Grace." Marsh's voice had become nearly inaudible. 3 years before his death, Lord Caedric executed an emergency succession transfer. Every holding belonging to House Valebrant, every mine, harbor, fortress, military contract, and sovereign acre was placed under the legal authority of— He stopped. "Say it." "Lady Evelyn Marrow." The silence that followed was not empty. It was pressurized, the kind of silence that exists inside sealed chambers before the charge detonates. Caedric stared at the document, his father's handwriting, his father's seal, his father's final devastating move from beyond the grave. Without Evelyn's consent, Caedric owned nothing. Not the fortress, not the fleets, not even the chair he was sitting in. The candles in the study guttered as wind pushed through a crack in the window casement, and somewhere south, moving through the dark and the rain toward a broken coastline no one had thought about in years, Evelyn Marrow pressed her gloved hand against the deed that held a duke's entire world inside its folds, and did not look back. Caedric did not sleep that night. He sat in the ducal study with his father's succession documents spread across the desk like an autopsy of his own empire, and he read every clause, every subclause, every precisely worded legal sentence that Caedric Valebrant had constructed with the patience of a man building a cage around his own son from the grave. The candles burned down to stubs. The fire died to embers. The rain outside beat against the fortress walls with the dull persistence of something that would outlast everything inside. By 3 a.m, he understood the full architecture of what had been done to him. It was not a single transfer, it was a system. Caedric had layered the succession amendment beneath 4 separate legal instruments: a routine estate consolidation, a harbor licensing renewal, a military supply chain audit, and a sovereign land survey, each one processed independently by different solicitors in different months. No single attorney ever saw the complete picture. No single document revealed the mechanism. It was only when you assembled all 4 instruments together and read the cross-reference clauses in sequence that the transfer became visible. Caedric's father had not just hidden a weapon. He had built it so that the only person who would ever find it was the one who had already been destroyed by it. The Duke sat motionless in his chair and felt something he had not experienced since the night his father died. Not anger. Anger was a tool he understood. This was different. This was the cold, airless sensation of discovering that the ground beneath you was never solid. That the man who raised you, who taught you every tactical principle you built your life around, had looked at the finished product and decided it needed to be contained. His father had not trusted him. That was the truth sitting in the room like a corpse no one had come to collect. And the worst part, the part Caedric could not kill no matter how many times he drove the thought into the dark, was that his father had been right. At dawn, he summoned Aldrich Marsh and General Corwick to the war room. The war room occupied the northeast tower of Blackmere Fortress, A circular chamber ringed with maps and navigation charts pinned to stone walls with iron tacks. The windows faced the harbor. On clear mornings, you could see the entire northern fleet anchored in formation, 47 warships carrying the Valebrant Wolf on their sails. This morning the fog was so thick the ships were ghosts. Corwick arrived first. He looked at Caedric's face and said nothing. He had commanded soldiers long enough to recognize the expression of a man who has received battle intelligence that changes the entire campaign. Marsh arrived second, carrying 3 leather folios and the complexion of someone who had not slept either. Caedric did not offer them seats. "What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room," he said. "Not to your staff, not to your families, not to anyone breathing inside or outside this fortress. If it leaks, I will know who talked, and the conversation that follows will be the last one they have." Corwick folded his arms. "Understood." Marsh nodded rapidly, clutching his folios like flotation devices. "My father transferred the entirety of the Valebrant estate into Evelyn's legal possession 3 years before his death." Caedric delivered the words with surgical flatness. No emotion, no inflection. The way a physician announces a terminal diagnosis, not because he does not care, but because caring would make the information harder to act on. Every mine, every harbor, every fortress, every military contract, every acre of sovereign land, all of it belongs to her. The silence that followed was not shock. It was the particular vacuum that forms when powerful men realize simultaneously that the structure they believed in has no floor. Corwick spoke first. "How?" Emergency succession clause buried inside routine estate processing, cross-referenced across 4 separate legal instruments. No single solicitor saw the complete transfer. "And nobody caught this in 3 years?" "Nobody looked." Caedric's voice carried the edge of a man who was including himself in the indictment and hating every syllable of it. "The estate archive passed through probate review as a standard inheritance package. My legal team processed it as administrative continuity. Nobody questioned whether the old man had reasons to restructure ownership because nobody imagined he would." "I imagined it," Corwick said quietly. Caedric's eyes locked onto him like targeting mechanisms. "I told you 3 weeks ago that Evelyn knew things about this estate you never bothered to learn," Corwick continued, his voice low and even, and carrying the particular weight of a man who has earned the right to say dangerous things. "I told you your father built contract hierarchies you never reviewed. You said there was nothing buried in those records. You were sure. Harlan, you were sure." The temperature in the room dropped by several degrees without the weather changing at all. Marsh cleared his throat with the delicacy of a man diffusing ordnance. "Your Grace, there may be a legal avenue to contest the transfer. If we can demonstrate that Lord Edric was not of sound mind when he executed the documents. My father was sharper on his deathbed than every solicitor in this fortress combined, and you know it. A competency challenge would be laughed out of the sovereign court, and it would make the transfer public. Right now, only 3 people in this room and 1 woman somewhere south of the border provinces know the truth. The moment this becomes a legal proceeding, it becomes political ammunition for every rival house in Varelis." "Then what do you propose?" Corwick asked. Caedric turned to the window. The fog had thickened. The harbor was invisible now. His entire fleet erased by weather, which felt like the kind of metaphor the universe constructed specifically to mock him. "Find her. And then? Then I make her an offer she would be foolish to refuse." Corwick studied him. The general's face carried the lived-in skepticism of a man who had watched Caedric negotiate with enemies for 20 years and understood that the word offer in the Duke's vocabulary had a significantly different definition than it did in the dictionary. "You mean you threaten her?" "I mean I present the situation clearly." Caedric. Corwick used the Duke's first name. He did this perhaps twice a year, always in private, always when the stakes had exceeded the capacity of protocol to contain them. "You threw that woman out of this fortress in front of 200 people. You moved her carriage to the service yard. You let servants strip her crest while she was still dressing. And now you want to ride south and present the situation clearly? The personal circumstances are irrelevant. The personal circumstances are the entire situation." Corwick stepped forward. "She holds the legal authority to dissolve every asset you possess. She holds it because your own father gave it to her. And the reason your father gave it to her is because he watched you become exactly the kind of man who would do what you just did. You think she does not know that? You think she sat in that carriage heading south without understanding precisely what she is carrying? Caedric said nothing. His jaw was set so tight the scar along his jawline whitened. She knows, Corwick said. She has always known. And the question you should be asking yourself is not where she is. It is what she has already started building with the weapons your father put in her hands. The answer came faster than any of them expected. Within 10 days, the first reports reached Blackmere from the southern provinces. Eveline Marrow had arrived in Grayfen, a coastal territory so ravaged by neglect and border skirmishes that the Crown had officially classified it as non-recoverable 5 years earlier. No functioning ports, no agricultural output, no tax revenue. The kind of place that existed on maps only because cartographers were obligated to include it. She had walked into the wreckage and started working. The intelligence came through Corwick's military scouts, men embedded in border garrisons who reported what they saw without editorial comment. The reports were clinical, factual, and progressively alarming. Week 1. Lady Eveline opened negotiations with the smuggling networks that controlled Grayfen's coastal waters. Not to shut them down, to formalize them. She offered legitimate trade licenses in exchange for cargo transparency and a 15% tariff that would fund harbor reconstruction. Week 2. She unlocked frozen grain reserves stored in abandoned Crown warehouses using authorization codes that technically belonged to House Valebrant, which technically belonged to her. 3 fishing villages that had been surviving on rainwater and desperation suddenly had food. Week 3. She hired mercenary engineers to rebuild the Grayfen Harbor breakwater. She paid them not in gold but in land grants and parcels carved from the Valebrant sovereign territory she now legally controlled. Men who had spent their lives selling violence for coin suddenly had property, suddenly had stakes, suddenly had a reason to protect something instead of destroying it. Corwick read the latest scout report aloud in the war room while Caedric stood at the window like a man watching his own reflection commit acts he could not prevent. She is not hiding, Corwick said. She is building. I can see that. She is building with your resources, on your land, under your family's legal authority, and every day she continues, the infrastructure she creates becomes harder to dismantle without destroying the economic base that funds your military operations. I said I can see that. Then see this. Corwick set down the report. The people down there are already calling her something. My scouts heard it in 3 separate villages. What? The Iron Duchess. The title landed in the room like a blade driven into wood. Caedric turned from the window. His face held the particular stillness that preceded his most destructive decisions. The expression Corwick had seen before sieges, before political assassinations, before the kind of tactical violence that won campaigns and ended careers simultaneously. She is not a duchess, Caedric said. She lost that title when the annulment was finalized. Titles are not given by courts, Caedric. They are given by people. And the people of Grayfen are giving her one because she is feeding them while you are standing in a tower arguing about legal technicalities. Watch your tone. My tone is the only honest thing you have heard in this fortress since the day you sent that woman away, and every advisor in your household was too afraid to tell you what it actually cost. The silence stretched between them like a wire under tension. Marsh had pressed himself so far against the wall he was nearly part of the architecture. Caedric broke first, not visibly, not in any way that a man less familiar with him would have detected. But Corwick saw it. A fractional shift in the Duke's shoulders, a release of pressure so small it was almost imaginary. The posture of a man who has been holding a defensive position and realized for the first time that defense is no longer an option. What is she actually doing, Harlan? Caedric asked. And for the first time, the question was not tactical. It was something raw. The voice of a man trying to understand a person he had lived beside for 5 years and never once saw clearly. What does she want? Corwick looked at him for a long time. I think she wants to prove that the thing you threw away was worth more than the thing you kept. Baptiste. The words went through Caedric like shrapnel. The kind that does not kill you immediately, but sits inside your body and shifts every time you move, reminding you that it is there, that it will always be there, that you swallowed it the moment you chose wrong, and now it is part of your anatomy. He left the war room without responding. He walked the corridors of Blackmere alone. The fortress was changing. He could feel it the way animals feel weather shifts, not through logic, but through something older, something that lived in the spine. The servants moved differently, not with less efficiency, but with less conviction. The military aides processed his orders with a fractional delay that would have been invisible 3 months ago and now felt like geological drift. The household accounts, which Evelyn had managed with a precision that made the Treasury auditors look amateur, were beginning to show discrepancies that multiplied like cracks in heated glass. She had been the circulatory system of this empire, not the heart. Caedric had made sure no one occupied that position. But the veins, the arteries, the 1,000 invisible pathways that carried resources and information and operational intelligence from one extremity to another. He had never noticed because functional systems are invisible. You only see circulation when it stops. It was stopping. He passed the East Gallery and found Celestine holding court with a cluster of noble advisors, her laughter calibrated to the exact frequency that communicated both charm and authority. She was magnificent at this. The social engineering, the factional management, the constant subtle redistribution of loyalty through compliment and implication. She played the court the way concert musicians play instruments, with technical precision and no soul. She saw him and detached from the group with practiced elegance. "You look tired, Your Grace. What are you discussing with Lord Halbert's delegation?" "Trade concessions for the southern corridor. Halbert's faction controls the grain routes and the southern corridor runs through Grayfen." Celestine paused. The pause was imperceptible to anyone watching from across the gallery, but Caedric caught it the way he caught everything, like a fault line registering a tremor too small for civilian instruments. "Grayfen is non-recoverable territory," she said smoothly. "The Crown classified it. Grayfen is no longer non-recoverable." Another pause. Longer this time. Celestine's eyes, pale blue, intelligent, constantly calculating, narrowed by a degree that most people would have attributed to the candlelight. "What has changed?" "Evelyn Marrow is rebuilding it." "With what resources?" Caedric studied her. He had chosen this woman because she was a weapon, sharp, precise, designed for a specific tactical purpose. But weapons do not ask questions because they are curious. They ask questions because they are identifying targets. "With resources that are currently under review," he said. "The matter is being handled internally." "I see," Celestine smiled. The smile had 3 layers. The surface was warmth. Beneath that was patience. Beneath that was the cold mechanical assessment of a woman who had been trained since childhood to identify the exact moment an alliance shifted from asset to liability. "If there is anything the Chancellor's office can do to assist with the review, you need only ask." "I will keep that in mind." She returned to the delegation. Caedric watched her go and felt the particular unease of a man who has invited a predator into his home and is beginning to notice that it has started mapping the exits. That night, a messenger arrived from the royal treasury. Caedric read the dispatch alone. The Crown Council had received an anonymous filing questioning the legal standing of House Valebrant's sovereign land claims. The filing referenced specific clauses in the estate succession, clauses that only someone with access to the original transfer documents could have known existed. The dispatch was formal, bureaucratic, the language of institutions protecting themselves. But the subtext was a declaration of war. Someone had leaked the succession transfer to the Crown Council, someone inside Blackmere. Caedric stood in his study, the dispatch crumpling in his fist, and felt the walls of his fortress closing inward like a trap that had been set years ago by a man who knew his son well enough to predict exactly how he would destroy himself. He could send soldiers south. He could attempt a military seizure of the documents. He could use the kind of force that had built his reputation and his empire and every piece of the machine he commanded. But force required legal standing. Legal standing required ownership. And ownership now resided in the hands of a woman standing on a frozen coastline 300 miles away, watching a harbor fill with ships that flew colors he did not recognize. He thought about her. He tried not to. He failed. Not the image the court remembered. The pale woman in silver silk walking through the hall in silence. Something else. Something from before the annulment, before the calculation. A night 2 years into the marriage. Winter. The fortress locked down by a storm that buried the northern coast in 4 feet of snow. The fires banked low because supply wagons could not reach the gates. Evelyn sitting cross-legged on the floor of the library with shipping manifests spread around her, rerouting supply lines in real time by candlelight, her handwriting small and precise and relentless, while Caedric stood in the doorway watching her work and feeling something he immediately classified as irrelevant. She had looked up, dark eyes catching the firelight. Not smiling, not performing, just present. A woman doing necessary work in a cold room because someone had to do it, and she had decided it would be her. "You should sleep," she had said. "I do not need sleep." "Everyone needs sleep, Caedric. Even people who have decided they are not allowed to be human." He had walked away. He always walked away. Because staying required a kind of courage that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with the terrifying possibility that another person could see you clearly and choose to remain anyway. And that possibility, that someone might know exactly what he was and still stay, was more frightening than any army he had ever faced. He stood in his study now, 3 weeks after throwing her away, and the memory sat in his chest like a coal that would not cool. The dispatch crumpled tighter in his fist. Behind him, the fortress groaned in the wind. Somewhere in its corridors, Celestine was charming nobles whose loyalty had an expiration date. Somewhere in the treasury offices, accountants were discovering discrepancies that would multiply. Somewhere on a dark road between Blackmere and the capital, a message was traveling toward rivals who would use this information to dismantle everything Caedric had built. And somewhere south, on a broken coast that no one had cared about, until a woman with ink-stained gloves and a document pressed against her wrist walked into it and started building from the wreckage, Evelyn Marrow was proving the one thing Caedric's father had always known: that the most dangerous person in any empire is not the one who sits on the throne. It is the one the throne cannot function without. Caedric set the dispatch on his desk. He pulled on his coat. He walked to the stables alone, in the dark, in the rain. He ordered a single horse saddled. No escort, no banners, no announcement. "Where are you going, Your Grace?" the stablemaster asked, and the old man's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who already knew the answer. Caedric swung into the saddle. The horse stamped against the wet cobblestones, breath steaming in the frozen air. "South," he said, and he rode out through the fortress gates into a night that swallowed him whole, toward a woman he had thrown away and a reckoning he was not prepared to survive. Behind him, a figure watched from the east gallery window as the Duke's horse disappeared into the darkness. Celestine Arden stood perfectly still, her reflection ghosting across the glass, and the smile that crossed her face had nothing warm in it at all. She turned from the window and walked to her writing desk. She had a letter to write, and the person receiving it would find its contents very, very interesting. The horse collapsed 9 miles from the Grafin border, not from exhaustion, from the crossbow bolt buried in its neck. Caedric hit frozen ground at full gallop and rolled through mud and ice until a stone wall caught his shoulder with the kind of impact that turned vision white. The horse screamed once, a sound that had haunted every cavalry officer since the first war ever fought, and then went silent. Blood steamed in the freezing air. He drew his sword before his vision cleared. Instinct. The muscle memory of a man who had been ambushed often enough that his body no longer waited for his brain to authorize survival. 3 figures emerged from the tree line. Not soldiers, not bandits, professionals. They moved with the coordinated spacing of men who had rehearsed the geometry of killing, 2 flanking wide, 1 advancing center, weapons drawn low and efficient. The center man carried a short sword designed for close-quarters work, not battlefield steel. Assassination steel. Light, fast, built for the singular purpose of ending a specific target in a confined space. "Duke Valebrant," the man said. Not a question. An identification. A hunter confirming the animal before the blade drops. Caedric's shoulder was screaming. Something had torn when he hit the wall. Muscle, tendon, something structural that would matter later if there was a later. He shifted his weight onto his back foot and raised his sword with his functional arm and felt the particular clarity that only arrives when the body understands that the next 60 seconds will determine whether it continues to exist. 3 against 1. Injured sword arm. No horse, no armor. 14 miles from the nearest garrison and 9 miles from a territory controlled by a woman who had every reason to let him die in a ditch. He had been in worse positions. Twice. Both times he had survived by doing something so violent, it became the kind of story subordinates told in whispers for years afterward. The flanking men closed simultaneously. Caedric did not wait for them. Waiting was defense. Defense was dying slowly. He drove forward into the center attacker with a speed that contradicted every injury he was carrying, and the collision was ugly. Not elegant, not cinematic, just 2 bodies and 2 blades meeting with the graceless efficiency of men who understood that combat was not performance, but mathematics. Angles. Leverage. Who commits first? The center man was good. Fast hands, disciplined footwork, the particular economy of movement that meant formal training. But he had been trained to kill targets, not fight soldiers, and the difference became apparent in the first exchange. Caedric's blade caught the short sword in a bind that forced the man's wrist to rotate past its structural limit, and the snap that followed was audible. The man stumbled. Caedric's sword found his throat before the stumble finished. The 2 flanking attackers hesitated. 1/2 second. In a tavern fight, that hesitation would mean nothing. In combat against a man who had commanded kill squads for 2 decades, it was a death sentence. Caedric pivoted on his back foot and took the left attacker through the chest with a thrust that used the man's own forward momentum against him. The body slid off the blade. The third man turned to run. He made it 11 steps. Caedric stood over 3 bodies in the frozen mud and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not horror, not the moral weight that poets attach to killing. Nothing. The emptiness was not numbness, like numbness implied something being suppressed. This was architectural. A space inside him where the normal human response to violence had been removed years ago and replaced with operational assessment. 3 men, professional killers, carrying assassination steel, waiting on a road that Caedric had not told anyone he was taking. Nobody knew he rode south tonight. Nobody except the stable master who saddled his horse, and whoever had been watching from the east gallery window when he left. The realization did not arrive as shock. It arrived as geometry, lines connecting points he should have connected weeks ago. Celestine watching him leave, Celestine asking about Greyfen's resources, Celestine's smile, that precise, layered, architectural smile, when he told her the matter was being handled internally. He had invited a weapon into his household, and now the weapon was pointed at him. His shoulder was bleeding through his coat. The cold was settling into the wound the way cold settles into old buildings, slowly, permanently, with the patient understanding that it had more time than the structure could survive. He needed shelter. He needed a surgeon. He needed information. He started walking south, 9 miles to Greyfen. Every step hurt in a way that confirmed his body had opinions about the last 30 minutes that his mind was not ready to process. He reached the Greyfen border at dawn. The landscape was not what intelligence reports had described. Corwick's scouts had painted Greyfen as functional wreckage, a territory clawing itself back from collapse through sheer operational will. What Caedric saw was something else entirely. The harbor town of Saltmere spread below the coastal ridge, like something that had decided to exist despite every reason not to. Stone buildings with new thatching. Market stalls being assembled in a central square that still bore scorch marks from border raids but had been swept clean and lined with trading posts. Smoke rose from chimneys. Fishing boats rocked in a harbor where the breakwater had been rebuilt with the kind of heavy engineering that spoke to serious investment and even more serious intent. Valebrant banners flew nowhere. Instead, a silver phoenix on dark blue cloth marked every public building and every ship in port. Eveline's seal, applied with the quiet authority of someone who understood that symbols were not decoration. They were claims. 2 sentries stopped him at the town gate. Not soldiers, militia. Fishermen and laborers carrying weapons with the determined competence of civilians who had been given something worth protecting and had decided to take the assignment seriously. State your business. Caedric looked at the man who spoke. Middle-aged, weathered face, hands scarred from rope and salt work, eyes that were not afraid of the bleeding stranger in front of him, but were very much aware that bleeding strangers on roads at dawn typically meant complications. "I need to see Lady Evelyn." "Lady Evelyn sees who she chooses. Your name." A year ago, Caedric would have answered that question by putting the man on the ground and walking through the gate without slowing. A month ago, he would have announced his title and watched the fear rearrange the man's face into compliance. Today, standing in frozen mud with a sword wound leaking through his coat and the ruins of his certainty scattered behind him like debris from a structure he had demolished himself. He said his name like any other man arriving at a gate he did not control. "Caedric Valebrant." The sentry's expression changed. Not fear, recognition. The particular look people wear when they have heard a name attached to specific damage and are now measuring whether the damage applies to them. "Wait here." He waited. 20 minutes. Standing in the cold. Bleeding. While a fishing village he had never considered important enough to think about decided whether he was worth admitting. This was what humiliation tasted like, when you could not deflect it with power. It tasted like standing still. The sentry returned with a woman Caedric did not recognize. Tall, mid-30s, dark skin, close-cropped hair, shoulders that suggested a history of physical work that had nothing to do with aristocratic leisure. She wore a heavy wool coat with the silver phoenix stitched on the collar and carried herself with the economical confidence of someone who had authority and did not need to perform it. "I am Marin Blackwell, Harbor Master of Saltmere and Senior Advisor to Lady Evelyn." She looked at Caedric's shoulder, then at his face, then at his shoulder again with a more clinical assessment. "You are injured." "I was ambushed on the coast road, 3 men, professional contract." "Sent by whom?" "That is what I need to discuss with Evelyn." Marin studied him the way engineers study damaged infrastructure, measuring what still functions, calculating what needs repair, assessing whether the whole structure is worth saving. "Lady Evelyn is in the harbor warehouse conducting trade negotiations. I will take you to the surgeon first." "I do not need a surgeon. I need to see—" "You are bleeding through your coat onto my gate. You will see the surgeon, or you will see the road back the way you came. Those are your options, Your Grace." The title was delivered without deference, without contempt, with the absolute neutrality of a woman who recognized the rank and had decided it did not purchase anything inside her jurisdiction. Caedric went to the surgeon. The surgeon was a former military medic who had served in the border campaigns and left the service after watching too many soldiers die from wounds that better supply lines could have prevented. She cleaned his shoulder, stitched the torn muscle, and told him he was an idiot for riding 9 miles without addressing the bleeding. "You could have lost the arm," she said, not looking up from her work. "I have been told that before." "By a surgeon or by someone who cared about you?" He did not answer. She finished the stitching, wrapped the shoulder in clean linen, told him to rest for 3 days, knowing he would not rest for 3 hours. Marin was waiting outside. She led him through the town without speaking. Caedric observed everything. He could not help it. Observation was not a choice for him. It was an autonomic function, the way breathing was an autonomic function, running constantly whether he wanted it to or not. The streets were clean, not wealthy, not decorated, clean. The functional cleanliness of a place where resources were scarce but deployed with precision. Every building that had been repaired showed the work plainly. New stone against old, fresh mortar against weathered joints. And there was no attempt to disguise the reconstruction. The scars were visible because the scars were the proof that someone had decided the damage was not terminal. People looked at him as he passed. They did not kneel. They did not lower their eyes. They looked at him the way people look at something they have heard about but need to evaluate for themselves. It was the most disorienting thing he had experienced since reading his father's succession documents. In Blackmere, people looked away from him. Always. Either from fear or deference or the survival instinct that told civilians not to make eye contact with apex predators. Here, a woman carrying a basket of dried fish looked directly at his face and then continued walking without adjusting her pace. He had spent 20 years building a reputation that made people avoid his gaze. Evelyn had spent 3 months building something that made people meet it. The harbor warehouse was a massive stone structure at the water's edge, its walls reinforced with iron banding that looked recent, and its doors standing open despite the cold. Inside, Caedric could hear voices. Not the hushed, careful voices of courtiers managing political exposure. Working voices. People arguing about lumber quantities and shipping schedules, and where to source rope heavy enough for the new dock cranes. Marin stopped at the entrance. She's inside. I suggest you remember that you are a guest in a territory you do not control and conduct yourself accordingly. Is that a warning? It is information. What you do with it determines whether you leave here having accomplished something or having made everything worse. Marin paused. You are very good at making everything worse, Your Grace. Your reputation confirms it. She walked away. Caedric entered the warehouse alone. The space was cavernous, crates stacked along the walls, long tables covered with charts and manifests. Lanterns hung from the crossbeams, casting warm yellow light across a floor covered in wood shavings and salt dust. 20 or 30 workers moved through the space with the organized energy of people who understood their tasks and were not performing for anyone's benefit. Evelyn stood at the central table with 3 men, a merchant captain, a supply coordinator, and someone who looked like a structural engineer. She was pointing at a harbor chart, speaking with the rapid precision of a woman who had processed the relevant data before the meeting started and was now distributing instructions with the efficiency of someone who did not have time to repeat herself. She wore dark wool, heavy boots, a leather belt with tools hanging from it, not decorative, functional. Her hair was pulled back and her hands were stained with ink and something that might have been engine grease or tar. No jewelry, no ornamentation, no single element of the visual language that Blackmere's court would have recognized as appropriate for a woman of her former station. She looked like a woman who had stopped performing and started working. She looked like someone Caedric had never met. She saw him. Her hands did not stop moving across the chart. Her voice did not change. She finished her sentence, gave 2 additional instructions to the supply coordinator, and only then looked directly at the man who had thrown her out of his fortress 7 weeks earlier. You are bleeding through your bandage, she said. I was ambushed. 3 assassins. Coast Road, 9 miles north. The warehouse went quiet. Not the anxious silence of a court, the focused silence of people listening for operational relevance. Evelyn set down her pen. Marin. The harbor master appeared at the entrance. She had not left. Send a patrol to the Coast Road, 9 miles north. 3 bodies. I want identification. Clothing, weapons, markings, anything that traces back to a contract. And double the overnight watch on the harbor approach. Marin nodded and disappeared. Evelyn looked at Caedric again. Sit down before you fall down. I am fine. You are swaying. There is a chair behind you. Use it or use the floor. Either way, you are going to stop standing. He sat, not because she told him to, because his body had decided unilaterally that the conversation about whether he could remain vertical was over. She dismissed the workers with a gesture. The warehouse emptied in 60 seconds. No questions, no hesitation. These people responded to her the way his soldiers responded to him. Not with fear, but with the functional trust that comes from watching someone make correct decisions under pressure, enough times that compliance stops being obedience and becomes investment. They were alone. The lantern light swung gently in the draft from the open harbor doors. Evelyn pulled a chair to the opposite side of the table and sat with the posture of a woman who had been standing for 14 hours and would stand for 14 more if the situation required it. Talk, she said. 3 professional killers were waiting on a road that no one knew I was traveling. Someone knew. Yes. Celestine. Caedric looked at her. The fact that Evelyn had reached that conclusion without explanation, without needing the chain of logic laid out, confirmed something he had refused to accept for 7 weeks. This woman had always been operating at a speed his court never measured because they were too busy measuring themselves. You are not surprised, he said. I would have been surprised if she had not moved against you by now. The only question was timing. Evelyn folded her hands on the table. Tell me what you know, and I will tell you what you do not. What I do not know. Caedric, you rode south alone, at night, on a road where someone tried to kill you. You are sitting in a warehouse in a territory you do not own, asking for help from a woman you publicly humiliated in front of 200 people. You can spend the next hour protecting your pride, or you can spend it protecting your life. Pick one. The silence that followed was the kind that reshapes rooms, the kind that exists between the moment a man recognizes the truth and the moment he decides whether to say it out loud. Every survival instinct Caedric had built over 20 years of political warfare told him to maintain control of the exchange, to withhold, to negotiate from strength, even when strength was a performance. But he was bleeding through his bandage in a borrowed chair in a fishing village, and the woman across from him had seen every mask he owned and was not interested in watching him put on another one. "The succession transfer is public knowledge," he said. "Someone inside Blackmere leaked the details to the Crown Council. The Royal Treasury has frozen my accounts. My military contracts are under review, and the woman I chose to replace you is negotiating with rival houses to inherit what is left after I am politically destroyed." Or literally destroyed. Or literally destroyed. Evelyn nodded, not with satisfaction, with the grim acknowledgement of a diagnosis confirmed. "Celestine has been in contact with House Davenmore since before the engagement was formalized. My sources in the capital confirmed the correspondence 3 weeks ago." "Your sources?" "I have spent 7 weeks building an intelligence network that actually functions. You should try it sometime. It is remarkably more effective than assuming everyone around you is too afraid to betray you." The cut landed exactly where she intended it. Caedric felt it in his chest. Not the wound, something worse, the dull recognition that every word she was saying was accurate. "What is she offering Davenmore?" "You." "The succession documents. Full military intelligence on Blackmere's defensive positions. And a marriage alliance once you are removed. Celestine becomes Duchess of Blackmere under Davenmore protection. The Chancellor gets his political influence preserved, and your bloodline disappears from the sovereign registry." The geometry was elegant. Caedric could see it the way he saw battle formations. Clean, efficient, designed by someone who understood that the best attacks used the target's own infrastructure against him. Celestine had not infiltrated his household. She had been the infiltration. From the beginning. The engagement was not an alliance. It was a positioning play. Move the operative into the center of the target's operations, map every vulnerability, and then sell the blueprints to the highest bidder. His father had seen it. Corwick had seen it. Evelyn had seen it from 7 weeks away and 300 miles south. Caedric was the only one who had not seen it, because seeing it required admitting that his judgment, the one weapon he had always trusted above all others, had failed at the most fundamental level. "There is something else," Evelyn said. Her voice had changed, not softer, more careful, the voice of someone delivering information that will cause structural damage. "Say it." "Aldrich Marsh, your chief solicitor. He has been communicating with the Chancellor's office for 5 months, since before the annulment." The name hit Caedric like a physical blow. Marsh, the man who had served House Valebrant for 21 years, the man who had stood in doorways holding leather folders with trembling hands and the complexion of institutional anxiety, the man Caedric had trusted with every legal instrument, every financial record, every contractual detail that formed the skeletal structure of his empire. "No." "Caedric." "No. Marsh is—" "He has been with the house since my father's time. He processed the succession documents. He would not—" And then he stopped, because the sentence finished itself. Marsh had processed the succession documents. Marsh had handled the transfer instruments. Marsh had been the solicitor responsible for reviewing the estate archive during the inheritance transition, the same archive that contained his father's emergency succession clause, the same clause that nobody caught because nobody looked. Nobody looked because Marsh had told them there was nothing to find. 21 years. 2 decades of quiet service, careful deference, the perfectly calibrated performance of a man who wanted to be seen as furniture. And beneath that performance, a channel running directly to the Chancellor's office, feeding intelligence about House Valebrant's legal vulnerabilities to the very family whose daughter was now dismantling the estate from inside. Marsh had not just failed to catch the succession transfer. He had known about it from the beginning. He had known, and he had kept it hidden, and he had waited until Celestine was in position, and Evelyn was gone, and Caedric was exposed on every front. And then he had leaked the information to the Crown Council at the precise moment that would cause maximum damage. The man Caedric had trusted to be invisible had been the most dangerous person in his fortress. Something cracked inside him, not dramatically, not the cinematic shattering that storytellers described when powerful men confronted betrayal. It was quieter than that. A structural failure deep in the architecture of who he was, in the load-bearing assumption that his ability to read people, to assess threats, to identify weakness before it became lethal, was the one competency that would never fail him. It had failed him 3 times. Celestine, Marsh, Evelyn. He had misread Celestine as an asset when she was an attack. He had misread Marsh as furniture when he was a weapon. And he had misread Evelyn as expendable when she was the only thing keeping the structure standing. 3 catastrophic misreadings, each one built on the same flaw. The absolute certainty that he could not be wrong about the people closest to him because he had never allowed anyone close enough to prove him wrong. Evelyn watched him process it. She did not speak. She did not offer comfort or analysis or strategic alternatives. She sat with the stillness of a woman who understood that some damage has to be experienced before it can be addressed, and that the worst thing you can do for a man whose foundation is cracking is hand him a scaffold before he has felt the full weight of what is falling. Caedric sat in the chair with his bandaged shoulder and his ruined certainties, and looked at the woman across the table who had every reason to let him collapse, and was instead giving him the one thing no one in his life had ever offered: time to be wrong without it costing him everything. "What do I do?" he asked. 3 words, the smallest sentence he had ever spoken and the most expensive, because it cost him the one currency he had valued above all others, the illusion that he never needed to ask. Evelyn leaned forward. Her dark eyes held his without softening, without hardening, without any of the emotional performance that their entire relationship had been buried under for 5 years. "You stop trying to save the empire you built," she said, "and you start deciding what kind of empire is worth building instead." Outside, the harbor bell began ringing, not the scheduled maritime signal. The emergency pattern. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. Attack warning. Marin's voice carried from the dock, sharp and cutting through the wind. "Ships on the northern approach. 12 vessels. Davonmore colors." Evelyn stood. The transformation was instantaneous. From stillness to motion, from strategist to commander, the shift so complete it was like watching a second person emerge from the same body. "How far?" 40 minutes, maybe less. Wind is behind them." Evelyn looked at Caedric. "Celestine is faster than I estimated," she said. "She did not wait for your political destruction. She sent Davonmore's fleet to take Grayfen while you were still on the road. She knew I would come here. She counted on it. You die here, the succession documents burn in the attack, and every legal claim I hold disappears with the evidence." Evelyn's jaw set. "She is eliminating us both at once." 12 warships against a fishing village with a rebuilt breakwater and a militia of former laborers. The mathematics were terminal. Caedric stood. The pain in his shoulder had become irrelevant, not absent, not managed, simply reclassified by a nervous system that understood the hierarchy of threats had just been restructured. "How many defenders can you field?" 300 militia, maybe 50 with actual combat experience. We have the breakwater fortifications and the harbor approach is narrow enough to bottleneck their landing. Against 12 warships, that is a delay, not a defense. Then we need to make the delay long enough for the defense to arrive." Evelyn was already moving toward the door. "I sent word to 3 allied merchant fleets 2 weeks ago requesting protective escort contracts. If even one responds, we have reinforcements within 6 hours. And if none respond?" She stopped at the door, turned, looked at him with the unflinching clarity of a woman who had calculated the probability of her own death and decided it did not change the immediate operational requirements. "Then we hold for 6 hours anyway." She walked out into the cold. Caedric stood in the empty warehouse with lantern light swinging above him and the sound of harbor bells cutting through the wind and the understanding, absolute, structural, irreversible, that the woman walking toward a battle she might not survive was doing it, not because she had no choice, but because she had decided that the thing she built here was worth defending even at the cost of everything. He had never made that calculation. Not once. Every war he had fought, every campaign he had commanded, Every act of violence he had committed in the name of empire had been driven by the same engine: acquisition, taking, holding, expanding. The logic of a man who believed that survival meant accumulating enough power that nothing could threaten you. And here was a woman defending a fishing village because it mattered, because the people in it mattered, because mattering was not the same as owning, and he had spent his entire life confusing the two. He pulled his sword, tested the grip against his wounded shoulder. The pain was significant. The pain was irrelevant. He walked out of the warehouse into the gray dawn light of Grafin Harbor, where 300 civilians were preparing to fight 12 warships, and a woman with ink-stained hands was giving orders that would determine whether any of them survived the morning. He did not walk toward the defensive line. He walked toward her. "Tell me where you need me," he said. Evelyn looked at him. 3 seconds. The longest operational pause she had allowed since the bell started ringing. "The eastern breakwater. If they flank, that is where they land first. Can you hold it?" "With how many?" 40. 40 against a naval landing force. "Can you hold it?" He met her eyes. And for the first time in 20 years, the answer to a question was not a calculation. It was not strategy. It was not the cold arithmetic of a man who only committed resources when the probability matrix favored return on investment. It was the decision of a man who had finally found something he was willing to lose for. "I will hold it." He turned toward the eastern breakwater. Behind him, the first Davonmore sails broke the horizon like blades cutting through the gray water, and the war for everything that mattered began. The first volley hit the breakwater before the sun cleared the horizon. Iron shot screamed across gray water and detonated against the stone fortifications with the concussive force of a world announcing that negotiation was over. Rock fragments exploded into the air like shrapnel. 2 militia fighters standing on the wall disappeared, not killed in any way the mind could process cleanly, but simply removed, converted from human beings into physics by the indifferent mathematics of cannon fire. Caedric grabbed the arm of the nearest defender and hauled him below the stone parapet as the second volley struck. The impact traveled through the breakwater like a seizure, shaking loose mortar dust that fell across their shoulders in a fine gray powder that tasted like chalk and the end of certainty. "Stay below the wall until the volleys stop," Caedric ordered. His voice carried the mechanical clarity of a man whose nervous system had shifted into a mode that existed beyond fear. Not courage, not bravery, but the cold operational state that takes over when the body recognizes that every second spent processing emotion is a second not spent surviving. "They will fire 3 more rounds to soften the position, then landing boats. That is when we move." The militiaman, a fisherman, maybe 30, hands built for rope and netting, not sword grips, looked at him with the wide, unblinking expression of a man whose world had just changed caliber. "How do you know 3 rounds?" "Because ammunition costs money and Davonmore is cheap." Third volley. The breakwater shook again. Somewhere behind them, a warehouse roof collapsed inward with a sound like bones breaking its scale. Caedric pressed his back against the stone and counted. His shoulder was bleeding again. The surgeon's stitches had torn during the sprint to the wall, and the bandage beneath his coat had gone from damp to saturated. He could feel the warmth spreading down his arm with the slow insistence of a problem that would become critical at a time of its own choosing. He had 40 defenders, fishermen, dock workers, 2 former soldiers who had ended up in Grafin the way broken things end up in forgotten places, by gravity. Against them, 12 Davonmore warships carrying somewhere between 600 and 800 professional Marines trained for exactly this kind of amphibious assault. The arithmetic was not survivable. He had told Evelyn he would hold the breakwater. He had said it without calculation, without the probability assessment that had governed every military decision of his career. He had said it because something in him had shifted during the hours between the ambush on the coast road and the moment he walked out of that warehouse. A tectonic adjustment deep in the machinery of who he was, like a compass needle swinging toward a heading it had never pointed to before. He was not holding this wall for Blackmere. Not for his estate. Not for the succession documents or the political architecture or the sovereign legacy of House Valebrant. He was holding it because Evelyn had built something here that mattered more than anything he had ever built, and the realization that he was capable of recognizing that, that the capacity had existed in him all along, buried beneath 20 years of conquest and acquisition and the systematic elimination of every instinct that could not be converted into tactical advantage, was the most terrifying and clarifying thing he had ever experienced. Fourth volley. He had been wrong about 3. The stone beside his head cracked, and a fragment opened a cut across his temple that immediately began filling his left eye with blood. He wiped it with his sleeve and tasted copper and salt, and the particular flavor of a morning that was going to get significantly worse before it got anything else. "Landing boats!" someone shouted from the north end of the wall. Caedric rose to a crouch and looked over the parapet. 8 longboats cutting through the choppy harbor water in a V formation, each carrying 30 to 40 Marines in dark armor. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of men who had practiced this approach until it was muscle memory, oars dipping and pulling in unison, the boats maintaining spacing that would allow them to beach simultaneously and establish a perimeter before defenders could concentrate fire on any single landing point. Professional, disciplined, expensive. Celestine had not sent a raiding party. She had sent an invasion force. "Archers to the wall," Caedric commanded. "Hold fire until they reach the shallows. I want every bolt hitting flesh, not water." The militia fighters, 12 with crossbows, the rest with fishing spears and repurposed dock tools, and the kind of improvised weapons that spoke to desperate creativity, moved into position along the parapet with the grim determination of people who understood exactly how unlikely their survival was and had decided that the math did not change the obligation. Caedric watched them and felt something he did not expect. Not pity, not the commander's detachment that treated soldiers as units in a tactical equation. Something closer to the feeling his father must have had when he looked at his own son and saw potential being converted into something colder than the potential deserved. These people were fighting because Evelyn had given them a reason to fight, not loyalty extracted through fear, not service purchased through wages. Something older. The basic human compact that said, if someone rebuilds your home and feeds your children and stands beside you when the world forgets you exist, you stand beside them when the world comes to take it away. He had never inspired that, not once. Every soldier who had fought for him had fought for pay or fear or the career advancement that came from serving a winning commander. Remove those incentives and the loyalty evaporated like morning frost. Evelyn's people were fighting for something that could not be removed because it lived inside them. The landing boats hit the shallows. "Fire!" 12 crossbow bolts sang across the gap and found targets. Marines stumbled and fell, but the others kept coming, surging over the sides of the boats into waist-deep water, shields raised, moving toward the breakwater with the relentless momentum of a machine designed for exactly one function. The first wave hit the wall. What followed was not battle in any sense that military historians would recognize as organized. It was violence at close range, chaotic, suffocating, stripped of every abstraction that commanders use to make killing comprehensible from a distance. A Marine came over the parapet, and the fisherman beside Caedric drove a boat hook into the man's chest, with a sound that would live in the fisherman's memory for every remaining night of his life. Another Marine crested the wall, and Caedric's sword met him in a lateral cut that opened the man from shoulder to sternum and sent him backward into the water below. Blood on stone. Blood on hands. Blood mixing with seawater and rain until the footing on the breakwater became treacherous, and every step required the kind of physical commitment that left you vulnerable to the next attack. Caedric fought with his injured shoulder and felt the wound reopen fully, a hot, wet, tearing sensation that sent pain signals his brain processed and filed and refused to prioritize because prioritizing them meant stopping and stopping meant dying. He killed the next man who came over the wall, and the next. His sword arm functioned through the pure mechanical stubbornness of a body that had been trained to fight past damage the way endurance runners train to run past exhaustion, not by eliminating the pain, but by building a tolerance for operating inside it. "They are flanking south," one of the former soldiers shouted. Caedric looked. 2 landing boats had broken from the main assault and were circling the breakwater toward the undefended section of shoreline where the old fishing docks jutted into the harbor. If they landed there, they would be behind the defensive line within minutes. "I need 10 people on the south dock. Now." We do not have 10 to spare.
Then I need 5.
We do not have 5. Caedric looked at the man. A former border garrison soldier with a face that had been rearranged by combat into something that communicated experience more eloquently than words. The man was not panicking. He was reporting. They were out of bodies. Caedric made the calculation that every commander eventually faces, the equation that separates leaders who survive from leaders who matter. Hold the wall with the forces available and lose the flank, or leave the wall and hold the flank himself and risk the main position collapsing. Both options led to failure. The only difference was the type. He chose the flank. Not because the tactical logic supported it. The tactical logic supported nothing. He chose it because the southern dock was closer to the harbor warehouse where Evelyn had been coordinating the defense, and if the Marines broke through there, they reached her first. He was making decisions based on what he wanted to protect instead of what he wanted to keep. The distinction would have been invisible to anyone watching. To Caedric, it was the difference between everything he had been and everything he was becoming. He ran south along the breakwater with 3 militiamen who followed without being asked, a dock worker carrying a boarding axe, a woman with a crossbow, and the expression of someone who had already decided how this ended and was not interested in discussing it, and a teenage boy who should not have been on the wall at all, but was there anyway because desperation does not check identification. They reached the southern dock as the first landing boat ground against the pilings. The fight that followed was the worst of Caedric's life. Not the bloodiest. He had commanded engagements where the dead numbered in thousands. Not the most dangerous. He had faced cavalry charges and fortress breaches, and the particular horror of night combat where you could not tell friend from enemy until the blade was already committed. This was worse because it was personal. Every Marine he fought was a body between Celestine's plan and the woman it was designed to destroy. Every blow he struck was not strategy, but refusal, the physical manifestation of a man who had spent his entire life acquiring things, discovering that the only thing worth fighting for was something he had already thrown away. The dock worker went down in the first exchange, a Marine spear taking him through the thigh and dropping him into the shallow water where the cold would kill him faster than the wound. The crossbow woman put bolts into 2 Marines before a third reached her position, and the fight went to close quarters where her weapon became useless. She switched to a knife and fought with the efficient ferocity of someone who had been underestimated her entire life and had stopped caring about the opinions of the people she was killing. The boy who should not have been there, fought with a fishing gaff and the terrified bravery of youth that does not yet understand that courage and survival are often mutually exclusive. A Marine twice his size came at him, and the boy drove the gaff into the man's leg and then froze. Because injuring someone and watching them scream was different from everything he had imagined when he picked up the weapon. Caedric killed the Marine before the man could recover. He pushed the boy behind him and felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like armor he had never worn. Not the abstract responsibility of command where soldiers were positions on a map and casualties were statistics to be managed, but the specific, unbearable, human responsibility of standing between a child and death. This was what Evelyn understood that he never had. That power meant nothing if it was not standing in front of someone who needed it. His shoulder finally failed. The sword dropped from fingers that had lost the ability to grip. The torn muscle had passed from damaged to structurally compromised, and his right arm hung at his side like a broken rigging line, functional enough to exist but not functional enough to serve its purpose. He switched to his left hand. He was not ambidextrous. Every cut would be slower, less precise, less lethal. Against professional Marines, the deficit would be fatal within minutes. He fought anyway. The crossbow woman was beside him now. They held the dock together, 2 people and a terrified boy, against a landing force that kept coming. Because landing forces do not stop when they take casualties. They stop when they run out of boats, or the objective changes, or every single person on the other side is no longer standing. Blood was everywhere. His, theirs, mixed with harbor water until the dock planks were slick and every step was a negotiation with gravity. Then horns. Not from the Davonmore ships, from the east. Deep, resonant horns that cut through the sounds of combat the way bass notes cut through noise. Not louder than the chaos, but somehow beneath it, carrying a frequency that made every person on the dock stop and look toward the harbor mouth. 3 ships flying merchant colors rounded the eastern headland in a line formation that spoke to naval discipline, not commercial scheduling. Their sails were full. Their decks were lined with armed men. And at the lead ship's bow, a banner Caedric did not recognize. A silver anchor crossed with a trade sword on a field of dark green. The Grafin Merchant Alliance. Evelyn's reinforcements. The effect on the Davonmore Marines was immediate. Not panic. Professionals did not panic. But the rapid tactical reassessment that happens when the cost-benefit analysis of an engagement shifts catastrophically. They had been sent to overwhelm a fishing village. They had not been sent to fight a naval engagement against armed merchant vessels with full crews. The flanking boats began pulling back from the southern dock. On the main breakwater, the marine assault faltered as officers processed the new naval reality and began signaling withdrawal. Caedric stood on the blood-slicked dock with his sword in his wrong hand and his right arm useless, and his face covered in a mask of blood and seawater, and watched the Davonmore fleet begin to turn. They were retreating, not defeated, repositioning. Celestine would not stop. People like Celestine never stopped because stopping required accepting a loss, and people who viewed the world as a series of acquisitions did not have the psychological architecture for acceptance. She would regroup, reassess, find another angle of attack. But today, this morning, on this dock, they held. The crossbow woman sat down heavily on the planks and pressed her hands against a wound in her side that she had apparently been fighting through for the last 10 minutes without mentioning it. The boy was shaking, not crying, shaking. The full-body tremor that follows the dissipation of adrenaline when the body realizes what the mind agreed to risk and presents the invoice. Caedric knelt beside the woman. How bad? I have had worse. She had not had worse. The wound was deep enough that the cold was probably the only thing slowing the bleeding to survivable levels. Get me to the surgeon and stop looking at me like I am dying. I am not giving you the satisfaction. He almost laughed. The sound that came out was not laughter, but something adjacent to it. The involuntary vocal response of a man whose emotional range had just been forcibly expanded beyond its previous operational parameters. He helped her up. He put his functional arm under her shoulder, and they walked back toward the harbor together. A duke and a fisherwoman and a boy who was too young for what he had just survived, moving through the aftermath of a battle that had not been won so much as endured. The harbor was destruction. 3 buildings burning. The breakwater scarred with cannon impacts that had reshaped its outline into something that looked like a jawline with missing teeth. Bodies floating in the shallow water where the landing boats had beached. Smoke and ash and the particular smell of aftermath, salt and iron and burned wood, and the organic sweetness of blood exposed to open air. Evelyn was at the central dock, directing triage with the focused intensity of someone who had been coordinating survival operations for the last 2 hours without stopping. Her coat was torn. There was blood on her hands that was not hers. Her voice was hoarse from shouting orders into wind and chaos, and the particular acoustic environment of a harbor under bombardment where normal conversation required the vocal force of a battlefield command. She saw Caedric. She saw his arm hanging useless. She saw the blood covering his face. She saw the woman he was carrying and the boy walking behind him with the hollow expression of the stolen innocence. She crossed the dock to him in 6 steps. The eastern breakwater. Held. The southern flank. Held. Your arm. Not held. She looked at him. 3 seconds that contained more honest communication than 5 years of marriage had managed. Then she turned to Marin, who had materialized beside her with the reliable inevitability of a person who understood that proximity to leadership during crisis was not optional. Get the surgeon to the south dock. We have wounded who cannot walk. And get me a count. I need to know who we lost, who is injured, and what structural damage the breakwater took before the tide comes in. Already counting, Marin looked at Caedric. You held with 40? I held with 3. Something shifted in Marin's expression. Not warmth. The harbor master did not appear to traffic in warmth as a primary currency, but the recalibration of assessment that occurs when data contradicts a prior conclusion. She nodded once and disappeared into the smoke. Eveline took Caedric's functional arm and guided him toward the warehouse that was serving as a field hospital. He did not resist. The part of him that would have resisted, the part that equated accepting help with broadcasting weakness, had been beaten out of him on a blood-slick dock by the simple mechanical reality that a man with one working arm cannot treat his own wounds. Inside the warehouse, wounded militia fighters lay on makeshift cots assembled from dock planks and fishing nets. The surgeon was already working, moving from patient to patient with the practiced triage of someone who had learned long ago that time spent on cases you cannot save is time stolen from cases you can. Eveline sat Caedric on a crate and cut his coat away from his shoulder with a fisherman's knife. "This needs more than stitches," she said, examining the torn muscle with the clinical detachment of someone who had spent 7 weeks dealing with injuries, supply shortages, and structural collapses and had developed opinions about wound management. "The surgeon will have to close this in layers." "It can wait. It cannot wait, and you know that, so stop performing." He looked at her. The word landed with a precision she probably intended. Performing. The accusation embedded inside it, that his refusal to acknowledge damage was not toughness, but theater. A show staged for an audience of one. Himself. "Why did you send for reinforcements 2 weeks ago?" he asked. "Because I anticipated the attack. 2 weeks ago I had not left Blackmere. 2 weeks ago the Davonmore alliance was not yet confirmed. You could not have known Celestine would move this fast." "I did not anticipate Celestine. I anticipated you." Eveline set down the knife. "I knew you would come south eventually. I knew that when you did, you would leave Blackmere exposed. And I knew that whoever was operating against you from inside your household would use your absence as the trigger. You anticipated that I would come to you. I anticipated that you would run out of options and that I was the only option left. That is not the same thing as coming to me, but the operational result is identical." The honesty in that statement was surgical. She was not romanticizing his arrival. She was not retroactively assigning meaning to a decision that had been driven by desperation. She was giving him the truth. Flat, undecorated, stripped of the narrative embellishment that powerful people use to convert their failures into something palatable. He had come to her because he had nowhere else to go. And she had prepared for his arrival because she understood him well enough to predict the trajectory of his collapse. The surgeon arrived. She looked at his shoulder, said something unflattering about people who reopened surgical wounds during amphibious combat, and began the process of repairing what his mourning had destroyed. Caedric sat still through the procedure. Not because he was brave, because Eveline was sitting across from him and he had discovered, in the last 12 hours, in the wreckage of every assumption he had built his life around, that her presence made stillness possible in a way nothing else ever had. When the surgeon finished, Marin returned with the damage report. 14 dead, 31 wounded. The eastern breakwater structurally compromised but functional. 2 warehouses destroyed, 7 fishing boats sunk at their moorings, and a messenger had arrived from Blackmere. Marin handed the dispatch to Eveline, who read it and then looked at Caedric with an expression that carried the particular weight of information that changes everything. "Celestine has declared herself acting Duchess of Blackmere in your absence. She has the Chancellor's endorsement and the support of 3 Crown Council members. She is convening an emergency succession hearing tomorrow at the fortress." The words entered the room and rearranged its architecture. "If that hearing proceeds," Eveline continued, her voice steady and precise and carrying the absolute clarity of a woman who had been 3 moves ahead of this situation since the day she left Blackmere, "Celestine establishes legal precedent for her authority. Your military commanders will be forced to choose between a present duchess with Crown Council backing and an absent duke with frozen assets and no legal standing." "How long do we have?" "The hearing is at noon tomorrow. It is currently 4 in the afternoon. We have 20 hours. 20 hours to reach Blackmere, enter a fortress controlled by a hostile occupant, and dismantle a legal proceeding backed by the Crown Council." "Yes." Caedric looked at his bandaged shoulder, at the warehouse full of wounded fighters, at the harbor still smoking from an attack that had nearly erased everything Eveline had built, at the woman sitting across from him who had spent 7 weeks constructing a world from wreckage and had just watched it get shelled by warships sent by the woman he had chosen to replace her. "You have the estate deeds," he said. You have legal authority over every Valebrant holding. You could let Celestine take the fortress and use your legal position to dismantle her claim from here. Slower, safer, no risk of walking into a trap. I could, but you will not. Evelyn stood. She looked toward the harbor where the Merchant Alliance ships were now anchored in defensive formation, and the smoke was beginning to thin as fires burned themselves out, and the afternoon light turned the water from gray to something almost silver. Blackmere is not just a fortress, she said. It is 3,000 people who live inside those walls, servants, soldiers, their families. If Celestine consolidates power, every person who ever showed loyalty to your household becomes a political liability she will need to eliminate. I'm not going to let that happen from 300 miles away. Even if going back means walking into the place where I destroyed your life. She turned to him. Her dark eyes held the kind of steel that was not forged in violence, but in the patient, accumulative process of surviving damage that was supposed to be terminal and choosing to function anyway. You did not destroy my life, Caedric. You destroyed your version of my life. There is a difference. And the difference is standing in this harbor right now, on fire, full of wounded people, and still here. The merchant fleet captain appeared at the warehouse entrance, a heavy-set woman with salt-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had navigated more storms than she bothered counting. Lady Evelyn, my ships can have you at Blackmere Harbor by dawn if we leave within the hour. But my crews just watched a naval engagement, and they are going to want to know what they are sailing into. Evelyn looked at Caedric. Tell her. He stood. His shoulders screamed. His body had logged formal objections to every movement he had made in the last 6 hours and was now escalating to the executive level. He told the captain. Everything. The succession transfer, Celestine's conspiracy, the Chancellor's backing, the Crown Council hearing, the fact that Blackmere Fortress was currently occupied by a hostile force with legal pretensions and military assets and the full support of the most powerful political family in Varelis. The captain listened without expression. When he finished, she looked at Evelyn. You are asking my ships to sail into a sovereign military harbor and support what amounts to a counter-coup against a chancellor-backed authority. Yes. The legal exposure alone could destroy my fleet's trade licenses. The legal exposure is mine. The estate deeds give me sovereign authority over Blackmere Harbor. Any vessel operating under my authorization is legally protected. The captain studied her, then studied Caedric, then looked back at Evelyn with the evaluative pragmatism of a woman who had built her career on assessing which risks paid and which risks buried you. We leave in 40 minutes. She turned to go, stopped. My crew fights for pay, but they fight harder for people they respect. Whatever you built here in 7 weeks, Lady Evelyn, it bought you something money does not buy. She paused. It bought you people who will bleed for you without being ordered to. She left. Evelyn closed her eyes. 3 seconds. The only pause she had allowed herself since the harbor bells started ringing at dawn. When she opened them, the exhaustion was visible. Not performed, not strategically deployed, but real. The accumulated weight of a woman who had been carrying an impossible load and had just agreed to carry it 300 miles further. We need to go, she said. Caedric nodded. He reached for his sword with his left hand. The wrong hand, the hand that would fight at 70% efficiency against opponents trained to kill at full capacity. He was riding toward a fortress he might not survive entering, beside a woman he had thrown away, to fight a war he had created by being exactly the kind of man his father had warned the world about. The merchant ships began unfurling their sails in Grafin Harbor, and somewhere north, in a throne room lit by 1,000 candles beneath the carved wolf seal of House Valebrant. Celestine Arden sat in the Duchess's chair and waited for the dawn that would make her the most powerful woman in the empire, unaware that the dawn was bringing something she had not calculated for. 2 people who had finally stopped destroying each other and started fighting together. Blackmere appeared through the fog at first light like something the sea had dreamed and then refused to release. Caedric stood at the bow of the lead merchant vessel and watched his fortress materialize from the gray, tower by tower, battlement by battlement, the black granite walls rising above the cliff face with the ancient indifference of a structure that had witnessed the rise and collapse of 6 generations, and had formed no opinion about any of them. The wolf banners still flew from the upper ramparts. The harbor cannons still pointed their iron mouths toward the sea. From this distance, nothing had changed. But distance was a liar. Distance was how empires maintained the illusion of permanence, by being seen only from far enough away that the fractures in the foundation stayed invisible. Evelyn stood beside him. She had not slept during the crossing. Neither had he. They had spent the night in the captain's quarters reviewing the legal architecture of what they were about to attempt. And the conversation had been conducted with the clinical precision of two people dismantling an explosive device, each word chosen for accuracy, each silence measured against the possibility that a single miscalculation would detonate everything. The plan was not complicated. Complicated plans required resources and time, and the cooperation of variables that could not be controlled. Simple plans required only the willingness to walk into a room and let the truth do the damage. Evelyn carried the estate deeds in a leather case against her chest. The original documents, the signatures, the seals, the legal instruments that Caedric Valebrant had constructed with the meticulous patience of a man who understood that the most powerful weapon in any empire was not military force, but the piece of paper that determined who owned it. "The hearing is scheduled for noon," she said. "If we enter the harbor now, Celestine will know we are coming. She will have 2 hours to prepare." "Let her prepare." Caedric's voice was raw, not from shouting commands during yesterday's battle, but from the particular erosion that occurs when a man has been awake for 36 hours and has spent most of that time confronting the accumulated cost of every decision he has made for the last 20 years. Preparation is what she does. It is the only thing she does. She prepares and she positions and she calculates and she moves pieces around a board. But she has never once been in a room where the situation could not be managed. She has never been in a fight where the outcome was not predetermined by the politics she arranged beforehand. And you want to give her a situation she cannot manage. I want to walk into my own throne room and tell the truth. To every person in that chamber. About what I did. About what my father did. About what Celestine is doing. And then I want you to stand beside me and let them see who actually holds the authority to determine whether House Valebrant survives. Evelyn looked at him. The dawn light caught the angles of her face and illuminated the exhaustion there. Not weakness, not the decorative fatigue of someone performing sacrifice, but the deep structural tiredness of a woman who had been carrying the weight of someone else's empire since the day a dying man handed her the deed to it and asked her to save his son from himself. "You understand what you are proposing," she said. "You are proposing to stand before the entire Varellus court and admit that you are not the legal owner of your own estate, that your father transferred everything to the wife you discarded, that you have been operating without legitimate authority for 3 years. The political damage will be permanent. There is no version of this confession that preserves your reputation." "My reputation." Caedric tasted the word the way you taste something that has gone rancid. "My reputation is a story I told about myself to people who were too afraid to contradict it. It was never real. It was armor I built out of other people's fear and then mistook for actual strength because I never stood anywhere long enough without it to find out what was underneath." "And what is underneath?" He looked at the fortress growing larger through the fog, the place where he was born, the place where he had become the man his father feared, the place where he had looked at a woman in wet silver silk and decided she was a line item to be processed and eliminated. "I do not know yet," he said. "But I think finding out requires being in a room full of people with no armor on and seeing what survives." The merchant fleet entered Blackmere Harbor at 7 in the morning. The effect was immediate. Harbor sentries scrambled to defensive positions. Signal flags went up the fortress communication towers. Within minutes, the fortress garrison, which had been operating under Celestine's interim authority since Caedric's departure, was mobilizing with the confused energy of soldiers receiving contradictory inputs about who they were supposed to be protecting and from whom. Caedric disembarked first. He walked down the gangplank in his torn coat with his bandaged shoulder, and his face still carrying the cuts and bruises from yesterday's combat and the particular bearing of a man who has lost everything that made him impressive and discovered that the loss clarified rather than diminished him. General Corwick met him at the dock. The old commander's expression went through 3 phases in 2 seconds: relief, assessment, and the grim recalculation of a military mind processing new tactical data. He looked at Caedric's injuries. He looked at the merchant ships. He looked at Evelyn's walking down the gangplank behind the Duke with a leather case and the posture of someone carrying a sovereign instrument. "You look like you fought a war," Corwick said. "I fought a dock. The war is inside the fortress." Celestine has the Crown Council representatives assembled in the throne hall. 3 council members, the Chancellor's legal proxy, 40 royal guards she imported from the capital under diplomatic security clearance. 40, armed, operating under the Chancellor's authority. Our garrison soldiers have been told to stand down pending the outcome of the hearing. Corwick paused. Most of them are standing down. Some of them are waiting to see what happens next. Which some? The ones who remember who they actually swore their service to. Caedric turned to Evelyn. She was already assessing the fortress with the comprehensive gaze of a woman who had managed its operations for 5 years and could read its condition the way physicians read vital signs, through the small details that revealed the health of the whole. "The household staff," she said. "Celestine replaced them?" "Some, not all. The senior stewards refused reassignment. She has them confined to quarters. Because she is afraid of them." Corwick raised an eyebrow. "Afraid of stewards?" "Afraid of people whose loyalty is not transactional. Celestine understands purchased loyalty. She understands coerced loyalty. She does not understand the kind that exists because someone earned it. That kind terrifies people like her because it cannot be outbid or threatened into compliance." Evelyn looked at Caedric. "We go in through the East Service corridor. It connects to the throne hall through the gallery antechamber. We enter from behind the assembly, not through the main doors." "Why?" "Because walking through the main doors gives Celestine time to frame our arrival as an intrusion. If we enter from the gallery, we are already inside before she can control the narrative." Caedric studied her. In 5 years of marriage, he had watched Evelyn manage accounts, resolve trade disputes, coordinate supply chains, and maintain the operational infrastructure of the most powerful estate in northern Varelis. He had never once seen her think tactically. He had assumed the capacity did not exist because he had never created the conditions for it to emerge. He was learning, in the slow, painful, relentless way that all real education occurs, that the things he had failed to see in other people were not absences. They were reflections of his own blindness. "Show me," he said. They entered Blackmere Fortress through the East Service corridor at 11:45, 15 minutes before the hearing. The corridor was narrow, stone-walled, designed for household staff to move through the fortress without being visible to the aristocratic residents. Evelyn navigated it from memory, every turn, every junction, every servant's staircase that connected the operational understructure of the fortress to its public spaces. She moved through Blackmere's hidden architecture with the fluency of someone who had spent years learning the building from the inside out, from the perspective of the people who kept it functioning, rather than the people who took credit for its existence. Caedric followed her and felt the particular vertigo of a man discovering that the place he called home had entire dimensions he never knew existed because he had never bothered to look at it from anyone's vantage point but his own. They reached the gallery antechamber. Through the heavy wooden door, the sounds of the throne hall were audible. The murmur of assembled nobles, the scrape of chairs on obsidian stone, the particular acoustic resonance of a large chamber full of people performing political attention. Corwick positioned himself at the corridor junction with 6 garrison soldiers who had chosen their loyalty without being asked. Their presence was not tactical. 6 soldiers against 40 royal guards was not a military solution. Their presence was symbolic, a statement that the fortress itself had not unanimously accepted the new regime. Evelyn placed her hand on the antechamber door. "Once we walk in there," she said, "there is no version of this that is quiet. No version that is clean. Everything you have built, everything people believe about you, every story this court has told itself about who you are, it all gets dismantled in public. Are you certain?" Caedric looked at her hand on the door. He looked at her face. He looked at the leather case she carried against her chest, the documents that held his entire legacy in their folds, the weapon his father had built and placed in the hands of the one person who could be trusted not to use it for destruction. I spent 20 years being certain, he said. Certain I was right. Certain my judgment was reliable. Certain that strength meant never needing anyone and never admitting that I was wrong. And that certainty cost me everything that actually mattered. So no, I am not certain. I am not certain about anything anymore. But I think that might be the first honest thing I have felt in a very long time. She opened the door. The throne hall of Blackmere Fortress was full. 200 nobles in formal court dress occupied the gallery seats in the same configuration they had filled 8 weeks earlier when Caedric had stood on the platform and annulled his marriage. The same obsidian floor reflecting the same iron chandeliers. The same ancestral war paintings staring down from vaulted ceilings with the permanent disapproval of dead men who believed their legacy was indestructible. Celestine Arden sat in the Duchess's chair on the raised platform. She wore black velvet trimmed with gold, the Valebrant ceremonial colors she had adopted with the seamless confidence of a woman who believed that authority was a costume you put on when the audience was assembled. The Chancellor's legal proxy stood beside her. 3 Crown Council members occupied the judicial seats. 40 royal guards lined the walls. The hearing had not yet begun. It never would. Eveline walked through the gallery antechamber door and into the throne hall with Caedric beside her and the estate deeds in her hands, and the sound that traveled through the assembly was not a gasp. It was something lower and more dangerous, the collective intake of breath that occurs when a room full of people realizes simultaneously that the performance they were watching has just been interrupted by reality. Celestine saw them, her composure held, trained, disciplined, reinforced by years of political conditioning that taught her to process surprise as data rather than emotion. But her hands moved, a small adjustment of her position in the chair, the unconscious recalibration of a woman who had prepared for every contingency except the one walking toward her. This hearing is not authorized by... The Chancellor's proxy began. This hearing is not happening, Eveline said. Her voice carried across the obsidian floor with a clarity that did not require volume. Because the person who convened it has no legal authority to convene anything inside this fortress. She walked the center aisle, the same aisle she had walked 8 weeks ago in wet silver silk, alone, stripped of her crest, carrying nothing but the silence of a woman who had already done the math. She walked it now in dark wool and heavy boots with ink-stained hands and the leather case that held the legal architecture of an empire. And the difference between the two walks was the difference between a woman being exiled and a woman coming home. Caedric walked beside her. Not behind, not ahead. Beside. The spatial relationship was deliberate, and both of them knew it. This was not a duke being followed by an accessory. This was 2 people approaching a shared objective with equal authority, and the court could see it in the geometry of their movement. They reached the platform. Celestine stood. The smile she deployed was a masterwork of controlled composure, warm, pitying, the expression of a woman watching someone attempt something futile. Caedric, you look unwell. And Lady Eveline, I was not aware the proceedings required your attendance, given that you have no standing in... I have standing in every room this estate contains. Eveline set the leather case on the judicial table, and the documents in this case are the reason. She opened the case and laid out the estate deeds. The original instruments, Lord Caedric Valebrant's signature, the sovereign seal. The emergency succession clause that transferred everything, every mine, harbor, fortress, military contract, an acre of land belonging to House Valebrant, into the legal authority of Lady Eveline Marrow. The Crown Council members leaned forward. They read. They looked at each other. They looked at the signatures and the seals and the cross-referenced legal instruments that connected 4 separate documents into a single, irrevocable transfer of sovereign ownership. The room changed, not loudly. The way rooms change when the architecture of assumption that everyone has been standing on suddenly reveals itself to be temporary. 200 people recalculating simultaneously. Every alliance, every political bet, every career decision that had been made on the assumption that Celestine Arden was about to become the most powerful woman in Varelis, all of it now suspended in the gap between what they had believed and what the documents on the table actually said. Celestine's smile did not fade. It hardened. The warmth drained from it the way heat drains from metal, leaving something that was still shaped like a smile but functioned like a blade. documents can be forged. These were verified by the Royal Notary Office 6 years ago, Evelyn replied. The verification seal is on page 4. The sovereign witness is Lord Justice Hargrove, who retired from the bench 3 years ago and whose testimony has already been deposed and sealed in the Capital Registry. I had it deposed 4 days after I left Blackmere, because I knew this moment would come. Celestine looked at Caedric. You are going to let her do this. Stand there while a discarded wife dismantles your authority with paperwork. She's not dismantling my authority, Caedric said. My father dismantled it 3 years before he died, because he understood something I spent 20 years refusing to learn. He turned to the court. 200 faces. The same faces that had watched him annul his marriage with administrative coldness. The same faces that had applauded. The same faces that had whispered behind gloved hands and pretended not to be thrilled by someone else's humiliation. He owed them nothing. He owed the truth everything. I stood on this platform 8 weeks ago and threw away the person who held this estate together because I believed she was replaceable. I believed that because I had spent my entire life measuring people by what they could provide to my ambition and discarding them when the provision stopped being convenient. I was taught that power meant never being dependent on anyone. I was taught that vulnerability was a deficiency to be eliminated. And I built an empire on those principles, and it worked. It worked for 20 years. It produced wealth and military dominance and political influence and the particular kind of reputation that makes people kneel when your carriage passes. He paused. The silence in the hall was absolute, not the respectful silence of a court attending to its sovereign, the stunned silence of an audience watching a man dismantle himself in public without a safety net. And then I lost it, all of it. Not because someone took it from me, because I gave it away. I gave it away piece by piece every time I chose acquisition over connection, every time I treated a human being as a resource to be managed instead of a person to be known. Every time I walked away from a room where someone was trying to tell me the truth because the truth required me to change, and change felt like weakness. He looked at Evelyn. My father gave her the deeds because he knew I would do exactly what I did. He knew I would throw her away. And he knew that when the empire started falling apart, she would be the only person with both the legal authority and the moral architecture to save it. Not because she wanted power, because she understood what power was actually for. He turned back to the court. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to witness what happens next. Evelyn stepped forward. She laid the estate deeds flat on the judicial table where every council member could see them. Then she produced a second document, heavy cotton bond, freshly drafted, bearing a legal structure that the council members recognized immediately because it used a sovereign charter format that had not been employed in Varelis for over a century. This is a joint sovereignty charter, Evelyn said. It binds the Valebrant estate jointly under 2 names. It cannot be dissolved by either party without the consent of the other. No single ruler holds absolute authority. Military decisions, financial decisions, and sovereign land management all require dual authorization. It is, in effect, a permanent check on the kind of unchallenged power that almost destroyed this house. She looked at Celestine. It also makes your succession claim legally impossible, because the estate you are attempting to inherit does not exist in the form you are trying to claim. There is no single seat of power to seize. There is no throne to occupy alone. The architecture you built your conspiracy on has been redesigned. Celestine's composure broke. Not spectacularly, she was too disciplined for spectacle, but visibly. The controlled mask shifted, and what was underneath was not fury. It was the cold, recalculating emptiness of a woman who had built her entire identity on the manipulation of power structures, and had just discovered that the structure she was manipulating had been replaced while she was standing on it. You cannot do this, she said. The Chancellor will not recognize. The Chancellor's legal proxy is welcome to challenge the Charter in Sovereign Court, Evelyn said. The challenge will require the court to first verify the original estate transfer, which will make public the fact that the Chancellor's daughter conspired to seize a duchy through assassination, political manipulation, and a fraudulent succession hearing. I have the documentation, I have the testimony, and I have the depositions. She let the silence do the work. Celestine looked at the Crown Council members. They looked back at her with the rapidly cooling expressions of political survivors recognizing a losing position. The council withdraws its participation in the hearing, the senior member announced. His voice had the practiced neutrality of a man executing an exit strategy. The matter of Valebrant's succession is to be resolved through standard sovereign court proceedings. One sentence. The political infrastructure of Celestine's conspiracy collapsed in one sentence. The royal guards looked at each other. They looked at their employer, a woman whose authority had just evaporated in real time. They looked at the garrison soldiers who had begun filtering into the hall from the gallery entrances, loyal men who had been waiting for exactly this moment to declare their position. No one drew weapons. The violence that had been building for 8 weeks, the assassinations, the naval assault, the political maneuvering, the slow, systematic dismantling of an empire from within, ended not with a battle, but with the sound of 40 royal guards sheathing their swords and stepping away from the walls. Celestine stood alone on the platform, the Duchess's chair behind her, the Chancellor's proxy already moving toward the exit, the court watching with the particular fascination of people witnessing the conclusion of a power they had assumed was permanent. She looked at Caedric and Evelyn standing together at the base of the platform, and her expression settled into something that was almost admiration, almost hatred, and entirely the look of a woman who had been outmaneuvered by someone she had dismissed as irrelevant. "Love makes rulers weak," she said. Her voice was quiet, controlled. The last performance of a woman who understood that the exit mattered as much as the entrance. Evelyn met her eyes. "No, it makes them accountable. And accountability is the thing that terrifies people like you, because you cannot manipulate someone who answers to something other than their own ambition." Celestine held the gaze for 3 seconds. Then she walked down the platform steps, through the center aisle, and out of the throne hall without looking back. No one stopped her. No one needed to. The architecture of her power had been dissolved so completely that stopping her would have been a kindness. It would have given her the dignity of being considered a threat. The doors closed behind her, and the throne hall of Blackmere Fortress exhaled. The weeks that followed were not triumphal. They were not the cinematic montage of restoration that storytellers use to make the aftermath of crisis feel manageable. They were slow, difficult, unglamorous, and marked by the kind of exhausting administrative work that had no dramatic value whatsoever and mattered more than anything that had happened in the throne hall. Caedric and Evelyn signed the Joint Sovereignty Charter on a Tuesday morning in the ducal study, witnessed by Corwick and Marin and Aldrich Marsh's replacement, a young solicitor named Vance, who had the nervous energy of someone who understood that her predecessor had committed treason and was determined to process every document with the kind of forensic attention that made court archivists weep with professional admiration. There was no ceremony, no court assembly, no public declaration. Just 2 people signing a document that restructured the legal foundation of a 300-year-old estate, and then immediately moving to the next item on a list of operational emergencies that would take months to resolve. The frozen accounts were released after 2 weeks of sovereign court proceedings that Evelyn managed with the methodical precision of a woman who had been preparing legal arguments since the morning she left Blackmere, in a service yard carriage with one trunk and a folded document pressed against her wrist. Marsh was arrested. The betrayal, when it became public, caused the kind of institutional tremor that rippled through the Varelli's legal community for months. 21 years of service. 2 decades of quiet, careful, invisible treason. The story became a case study in the particular danger of trusting people based on their performance of loyalty rather than their demonstration of it. The Chancellor withdrew from political life. Not publicly, not dramatically. He simply stopped appearing at court functions and stopped returning correspondence, and eventually stopped being mentioned in political discussions the way a storm stops being mentioned once the damage has been repaired, and the sky has been clear long enough for people to start taking the weather for granted again. Grafin was formally incorporated into the Valebrant sovereign territory under Evelyn's direct authority, not as a subordinate province, but as a co-equal administrative region. The silver phoenix seal of Grafin flew alongside the Valebrant wolf on every official document and every public building and every ship that left the harbor. Marin Blackwell became the governor of Grafin. She accepted the appointment with the understated competence of a woman who had been governing the territory in practice for weeks and now had the title to match. Her first official act was to commission a permanent memorial at the Saltmere harbor dock, where 14 militia fighters had died defending a fishing village against 12 warships. The memorial was not a statue. It was a working dock expansion that doubled the harbor's capacity and was named after each of the dead. Because Marin understood that the best way to honor people who died protecting something was to make the thing they protected larger. The crossbow woman survived. Her name was Dara Keel. She had been a dock worker's daughter who learned to shoot because the border raids made archery a practical skill, and who had fought on the southern dock with a wound in her side because the alternative was letting strangers burn down the town she grew up in. She became the commander of Greyfen's permanent militia, not because she had military training, but because she had demonstrated the one quality that no training could manufacture. She had chosen to fight when fighting was not required, and people followed that kind of choice in a way they never followed orders. The boy from the dock, his name was Tomas, and he was 16, went back to his apprenticeship at the net-mending workshop and did not talk about the battle for 3 months. When he finally did, it was to his mother, late at night, and what he said was not heroic. What he said was that he had been afraid the entire time, and that the Duke had stood in front of him, and that he did not understand why a man like that would stand in front of someone like him. His mother, who had lived through 3 border raids and understood more about courage than any military strategist in Varelis, told him that the reason powerful men stand in front of ordinary people is the same reason ordinary people stand at all. Because the standing is the point, not what you are standing for, the act itself. The decision to remain upright when the mathematics of the situation say you should run. That was as close to philosophy as anyone in Greyfen got, and it was enough. Spring came to Blackmere the way spring comes to places that have survived winter, not as a gift, but as a negotiation. The ice broke apart in the harbor over a period of weeks, calving from the cliff face in massive slabs that hit the water with sounds like cannon fire and sent waves rolling across the harbor that rocked the ships at anchor. The sky shifted from the permanent gray of northern winter to something lighter, something that allowed color to exist, and the fortress walls, which had looked like carved darkness for 6 months, began showing the actual texture of the granite beneath. Gray and silver and flecks of mineral that caught the light in the late afternoon and made the ancient stone look almost warm. Caedric changed, not the way stories describe change, a dramatic transformation, a clear before and after, a moment of conversion where the old self dies and the new self emerges fully formed. He changed the way stone changes underwater, slowly, through constant contact with something softer than himself that nonetheless wore away the surfaces he had believed were permanent. He still commanded armies. He still terrified political opponents. He still carried the scar on his jawline and the particular bearing of a man who had spent 2 decades as the most dangerous person in any room he entered. Those things did not disappear. They were not supposed to disappear. They were part of what he was, and pretending otherwise would have been another performance. The performance of gentleness instead of the performance of strength, equally dishonest, equally hollow. What changed was the space behind the machinery, the part of him that decided what the power was for, the part that had been empty for 20 years, not vacant, but sealed, locked, deliberately evacuated because the man who lived there had decided early that emptiness was safer than the alternative. The alternative was letting someone in and discovering that their presence changed the structural requirements of who you were. The alternative was dependency, vulnerability, the risk that another person could see the full architecture of your damage and choose to stay or choose to leave, and either choice would alter you permanently because you had given them that authority by allowing them close enough to exercise it. Evelyn had that authority now, not because he had granted it in some deliberate act of emotional surrender, but because she had earned it through the accumulated evidence of 7 years, 5 inside the fortress and 2 outside it, during which she had seen every version of him, including the worst, and had neither flinched nor pretended the worst did not exist. She did not forgive him. That was important. She did not perform the ceremonial absolution that stories required of women who had been wronged by powerful men. She did not announce that the past was behind them, or that love conquered the damage, or that his transformation had earned him redemption. She told him, on a cold evening in the ducal study while they reviewed trade agreements that would take 6 months to finalize, that forgiveness was not something she owed him, and not something he should need from her. What you did caused damage, she said. To me, to this household, to yourself. The damage does not disappear because you feel differently about it now. It does not get erased by regret or compensated by sacrifice. It exists. It will always exist. And the question is not whether you are forgiven, but whether you are capable of building something with the person you damaged that is worth more than the damage. And if I am not capable, then at least you are asking instead of assuming, which is more than you have ever done before. He sat with that, not comfortably. Comfort was not the currency of honest reckoning. He sat with it the way he had learned to sit with everything in the last 3 months, in the full, unprotected awareness that the discomfort was the evidence of growth, and that growth, unlike conquest, did not come with the satisfying sensation of winning. It came with the slow, grinding, unglamorous work of becoming someone you had never been and not knowing whether the person you were becoming was any better than the person you were leaving behind. But the work continued, every day, in the decisions he made and the way he made them, in the meetings where he listened before speaking, in the moments where the old machinery spun up, the cold tactical calculation, the reflex to dominate, the instinct to convert every interaction into a power assessment. And he felt it engage and chose deliberately to let it idle while something else took the wheel. He did not always succeed. Some days the machinery won, and he made decisions that were efficient and merciless and exactly what the old Caedric would have made. And on those days, Eveline did not criticize him. She just looked at him with the steady, patient expression of a woman who understood that transformation was not a destination but a practice, and that the practice would include failures, and that the failures did not invalidate the attempt. On a morning in late spring, they walked together along the upper battlements of Blackmere Fortress. The sun was rising over the northern sea, and the light was doing something extraordinary, turning the water from dark iron to a shade of blue that only existed for 20 minutes each morning before the angle changed and the color retreated into the ocean's usual gray. The harbor below was full of ships, merchant vessels, fishing boats, 3 military frigates flying the joint banner of the Wolf and the Phoenix. The markets along the cliffside promenade were opening, voices carried up from the docks, workers calling to each other, children shouting on the pier, the particular acoustic signature of a place that was alive because the people in it had decided to make it so. Caedric stopped at the eastern parapet and looked out across the kingdom he had almost destroyed. Eveline stood beside him. The wind pulled at her dark hair and she did not push it back. She watched the harbor with the expression of a woman seeing 2 things simultaneously: what was there and what had been required to make it there, every repaired building, every reopened market, every ship in the harbor that flew colors representing an alliance built on trust instead of fear. She saw the cost of all of it. She carried the cost of all of it, and she stood there anyway. "Why did you save Blackmere?" Caedric asked. His voice was quiet. Not the strategic quiet he had used for 20 years to make people lean closer and feel the weight of his authority. Genuine quiet. The volume of a man asking a question he does not have the answer to and is not pretending otherwise. Eveline looked at the waking kingdom below. "Because power without mercy creates graves," she said, "but mercy without power creates victims, and I decided a long time ago that I was not going to be either." He studied her. Not the way he had studied people for 20 years, assessing, measuring, cataloging weaknesses and leverage points. He looked at her the way you look at something you are only now seeing clearly after years of looking at it through glass you did not know was distorted. She was the strongest person he had ever known, not because she had conquered anything, not because she carried weapons or commanded armies or built a reputation that made people kneel, because she had been damaged by the person closest to her and had chosen to rebuild instead of retaliate, because she had held the power to destroy him and used it to restructure instead, because she understood something that had taken him 40 years and the near total collapse of everything he valued to learn, that the measure of a person was not what they could take, but what they could sustain, what they could hold without crushing, what they could carry without becoming the weight. He did not say any of this. He was not a man who had developed the vocabulary for this kind of recognition, and he was not going to perform a fluency he did not possess. Instead, he stood beside her on the battlements in the early light and let the silence between them carry what words were not yet adequate to hold. Below them, Blackmere lived. Not because a ruthless duke had conquered it, because a woman he had tried to cast aside had taught him that empires built on fear survive only until the fear runs out. And the things that endure, the things that actually last, are built by people who decided that the work of holding something together was worth more than the power of tearing it apart. The sun cleared the horizon. The light touched the fortress walls, and for a moment the ancient black granite looked almost golden. And for the first time in his life, Caedric Valebrant stood inside his own kingdom and felt like he belonged there. Not because he owned it, not because he had fought for it, because he had finally learned what it cost to deserve it. The wind carried the sound of harbor bells across the cliffs. The day began.